Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second last session of this evening, and to a conversation about possibly India's most unusual neighboring country, the Maldives. I'm Teesta from Pan Macmillan India, the publishing house that not too long ago brought out a book called, also an unusual book called Descent into Paradise, a journalist's memoir of the Untold Maldives. And that journalist is sitting to my right, Daniel Bosley, whose own career trajectory is also almost as unusual as the subject of his book. So that's definitely one of our main themes this evening. 12 years ago, Daniel's postgraduate degree in international relations was yet to be put to good use. Owing to rising unemployment in the UK, especially after the Great Recession of 2008, he had found gainful employment hard to come by, and therefore he worked several odd jobs, even as a postman for a while, until by a stroke of serendipity, he landed an internship, and I must emphasize that it was an unpaid internship, at the Maldives High Commission in London. Through several more strokes of serendipity, in the autumn of 2011, he found himself making his way to the Maldives itself, this time for a paid internship at the country's only English language news website called Minivan News. Even though Daniel was well versed in international affairs, what he would come to discover about the Maldives through his nearly decade-long stay in the country almost defies belief. And every time I return to his book, it still manages to make my head spin. But yet, everything he writes in the book is all true. Because not too far away from the glittering white sand beach resorts, the resort islands, to a large extent uninhabited by Maldivians, is a country in utter turmoil. It had, when Dan was there, it had just risen out of years of a toxic dictatorship for a brief taste of democracy after its first multi-party elections in 2008, only to find itself, that democracy would soon find itself thoroughly undermined in 2012. The years that followed saw a shocking resurgence of political corruption, religious extremism, press freedom suppression, and unthinkable violence, while the criminal justice system fell into decay and sea levels continued to rise, compelling some scientists to suggest that by 2050, nearly 50% of the Maldives might be uninhabitable. This was clearly a country endangered on so many levels, and yet the world seemed all but oblivious to this very grim side of paradise. So, Dan, I would first want to ask you on that note, what your impressions were of the Maldives on your first visit there. And if you could also tell us a little about why you think a country that desperately needs global attention gets such little international coverage.
Well, thank you, Teesta. Yeah, my impressions of the Maldives before I arrived in the High Commission was I didn't know where the Maldives were. I never heard of the Maldives, and Wikipedia thankfully helped me secure the internship. But from there on, it was a rapid, exponential increase in my knowledge of the country. And yeah, the reason I think perhaps it doesn't get the coverage that it deserves is because nobody knew anything about the country either until maybe, let's say, 50 years ago. The country became independent in 1965. Before that, it was part of the British Empire, albeit a protectorate part of the British Empire. And there was just very little written about the place. The few people that had written the stories, I mean, if you think about books written about the Maldives over the past 2,000 years, I think people have been on the islands, maybe 3,000 are still working this out. You're talking about half a dozen books. So unfortunately, anybody else that wants to write a book about the Maldives, I think we may have saturated the market for maybe 300 years. So yeah, you might have to wait a while. But so there's not a lot known about the country, even within the country, because there's a tendency to not talk about the country, not talk about the history of the Maldives. I think that's what a dictatorship does to a country after a while. People don't want to talk openly about the history, about the secrets, about the less pleasant side of the country. And this is only exacerbated by when you become this tourism behemoth, and everybody here, has anybody been to the Maldives, incidentally? Show of hands, okay. No Maldivians here, right? No? Okay, then we can talk openly and honestly to each other. Yeah, the reason the coverage is not, people don't know a lot about the Maldives is, I think, for those reasons, and also because on top of this, there was this dictatorship up until 2008. We had multi-party democracy, the first multi-party elections in 2008, and free media, free expression has been something that came along with the economic growth in the sort of mid to late 90s, and this caused a lot of friction, but eventually they got the multi-party democracy. But before that, there's really no record of what was going on in the country. So it's always been very difficult to find out what happened even 15, 20 years ago. So at Minivan News, this is one of the things we were trying to do, to actually provide, to be the paper of record and provide that history. It was very difficult, but I think we did a decent job.
I mean, that's how I found out about Daniel, by reading some of his articles that he wrote for Minivan News, and also discovering his blog, 2000 Isles, which we will come to later. But you're right. I mean, the Maldives definitely has become much better known today. But one of the main reasons for that is definitely the rise of the tourism industry, which still means that there is still a lot that remains to be known about the country. But to touch on the tourism industry, as a luxury holiday destination, your book points out that it also makes the country a mind-boggling, it's a country of mind-boggling contrasts and paradoxes. Because while it's true that the industry after the 1970s rapidly transformed Maldivian economy and brought millions of tourists and millions of dollars to its shores, that new wealth has seen far from equal distribution, which means it has led to new power centers, new waves of corruption and ruthlessness. And also this sudden contact with the outside world has meant there's been rapid cultural evolution in the Maldives, which I think some within and without the country have preferred to see as cultural erosion. Could you explain to the audience some of these paradoxes that make up the Maldives and how they've, in the recent past, been reshaping the islands?
Yeah, I think I probably should have started maybe with some more facts about the Maldives. The Maldives is it's a nation of around between 400 and 500,000 people, depending if you want to count the large expat, mainly Bangladeshi population. They're spread over, there's about 1,200 islands in a chain of coral atolls, spreading over about 1,000 kilometers. So it's very dispersed. About a third of the population lives in the capital now. There's about 187 other inhabited islands, and getting close to a similar number of resorts now. The resorts have always been separate. You're talking about very small islands. The island I was living on before I left, you could walk across it in 15 minutes, and that was a big one. That was one of the big ones. So, yeah, it's hard to get exercise, actually. So this is why the tourism sector has always been kind of isolated. When tourism first went to the Maldives, there was concern that people weren't used to foreigners. Like I say, it had been very isolated for 2,000 years, and there was this concern that all these foreigners were going to come in, and it was going to be very disruptive to local culture. And Teesta talked about the contradictions, the main contradiction with the tourism industry and Divehi society is this issue with the Maldives being 100% Islamic. This is not something I knew about before I went there. It's actually locked into the constitution. Some very short-sighted politician, actually one of the resort owners, decided this would be a good idea to enshrine this in the constitution in 2008. So now, the moment you're born, you're a Maldivian, and you're a Muslim. The two things are completely locked together, and that makes it difficult for the resort industry to exist alongside, because it's an industry that's basically fueled on pork and alcohol. So this is not an easy contradiction, and it leads to it's almost an Orwellian kind of doublethink that goes on there, how these two things can be compatible. In terms of what it's done economically, it's taken the Maldives from what had always been a subsistence economy. For 2,000 years, it had been very difficult for the Maldives to make any money. There'd been nothing to trade. Even today, 90+% of the exports from the country are tuna. It's always tuna, tuna for breakfast, tuna for lunch, tuna for dinner. I like tuna, so it's fine. But yeah, economically, it's not great. And up until the 60s, the only way they could make money was by selling a lot of dried fish to Sri Lanka. So the tourism industry has completely turned on its head. It's gone from being one of the poorest nations in the world to the richest per capita in South Asia. And this is a lot of cash. And now the cash is washing around, and multi-party democracy comes along, and that gets whipped up as well. And we'll talk about other negatives that is brought along with it later. But yeah, it's basically the country that it's been breakneck, whiplash sort of change. And you can see it there now that the islands are really sort of struggling to absorb all this change.
Interesting that you mention the tourism industry is driven in large part by pork and alcohol, because on the flip side of the rise of this industry is another issue that's been plaguing the country in the recent past, which is that of religious extremism, with many Maldivians having turned ISIS sympathizers and developed ties with groups like Al-Qaeda. For instance, I want to quote from your epilogue, Dan, where you write, "It was revealed by a police commissioner that the police knew of at least 1,400 extremists in the country who would not hesitate to take the life of the person next to them." He reported that 173 Maldivians had crossed into Syria. In an alarming first, 3 tourists were stabbed in an attack in Hulu Male. That's not the airport, is it?
It's just next to the airport.
Yeah. In early 2020, which was also claimed by the Islamic State. The government thwarted a number of further attacks and arrested an Islamic State recruiter. In August 23, the US Treasury placed sanctions on 20 Maldivians it considered to be Al-Qaeda or ISIS operatives. So I was wondering what, in your opinion, would have led to such circumstances?
I think Islam has always been used as a way to control the population in a way that in a country like that, I think we'll get onto the issue of violence later, but you need to control that. This idyllic idea of this desert island paradise can quickly become Lord of the Flies if the state doesn't keep a firm grip on the use of violence. And control is very important, and religion has always been used for those reasons. So the former dictator, his name is Mamun Abdul Gayoom. He spent a lot of time studying in Egypt when he was young, in the 60s, at Al-Azhar University. And he came back with a lot of ideas that he wanted to really push this brand of Islamic nationalism in the Maldives, which in theory, that's a nice idea if you can get it to work. But obviously, when he returned to the Maldives in the 70s, things were happening in the Middle East. You've got the petrodollars fueling this kind of Salafi, Wahhabi rhetoric from Saudi Arabia, and the narrative that the Maldivian leader would have been able to control was no longer in his hands. So if you look at from the 80s and 90s, like I said, there's very little written down, but there's more and more incidents of Maldivians going from small islands to study in madrasas in Riyadh, or more often in Pakistan, and coming back and essentially radicalizing whole islands. Now, this has become more of a problem because after 9/11, the rise of disinformation on the internet, it's a huge ructions within the Islamic world, and the Maldives was affected just as any other country would be. But at the same time, at that time, the country is opening up in a way that it hadn't before. So people are allowed to talk about these things in a way that they hadn't been able to. And obviously these ideas are always appealing to some people. So when they let the human rights activists out of jail, and when they gave them a platform to speak, and when they let the pro-democracy activists out of jail and let them speak, out of the jails also came some of these more extremist groups. And this is what we've gotten to today. I think we'll probably get onto more of the specifics about this.
I felt, while reading the book, I was able to sort of trace, with this rise of religious extremism, I suppose it's inevitable that there was also a rise in violence in the Maldives. And it was really intriguing to read in the book that until probably 50, 60 years ago, anthropologists have described the Maldives as a country that's almost entirely free from violence. And yet, in recent years, it's become all too common. And in fact, even the former president who was elected in the first democratic elections in 2008, Mohammad Nasheed, he sustained life-threatening injuries from an attempted assassination. What would you say has led to this situation? Is all of this driven by increased religiosity? Are there other factors involved as well?
No, it's become somewhat of a perfect storm in the last few years. Like we said, violence has always had to be kind of kept a firm lid on, otherwise things can get quite anarchic on the islands. And yeah, I noticed that as soon as I went there. Coming from the UK, especially the north of the UK, people like a fight. They do. People are quite scrappy. And you don't get that in the Maldives at all. People are very sort of pacific in nature, and they're very calm. And the normal outlets for any inclinations or anger would be politics, which is very fractious, and quite often divorce. The country has the highest divorce rate in the world, which is unusual, obviously, for a Muslim country. So, yeah, there's a whole chapter about that. My wife wasn't very happy about me writing that chapter, but it's an interesting subject. But in terms of what's happening with violence in the country now, as I mentioned, a third of the population lives in the capital, and economic development has brought advances in healthcare and education, but they're mainly centralized. So this is drawing more people into the capital. A lot of young guys that, you know, traditionally would have been fishermen. Now that they're kind of cooped up in Mali, and as anybody who studied this knows, that this is a good recipe to get a gang culture thriving. So drugs, heroin mainly, made its way into the country in the 90s. This was not a problem they were familiar with. They had to start throwing lots of people in jail towards the end of the Malmun dictatorship. They had to build these jails first. Traditionally, what you would do in the Maldives is you would banish people to smaller islands. Banishment was still going on up until just a few years ago. But obviously, everyone's got motorized transport, and you can just get online. It's completely pointless now trying to send someone to a desolate island and to get rid of them. But so there was a lot of jails that were new, and the criminal justice system couldn't really handle this drugs problem. So you radicalize a lot of young men in the jails. The gangs start to make a lot of money from the drug trade. Like I said, there's a lot of money washing around the country. The money from the politics gets fed into the gangs as well. I think the first gang killing came around 2007, and it's just spiraled. By the time I arrived in the country, there'd be a murder every month. When explorers and colonial officers and historians would visit the country before, they'd be told, there's no violence here. I don't personally believe that's true, because everywhere people are people everywhere, right? Maldivians are obviously very different, and that culture makes people more pacific in nature. But you will always get that in communities. I just think it's something they don't glorify. It's something they don't like to talk about. And obviously, when some random foreigner turns up, they're not really going to want to talk to him in great detail about the guy that got killed over, I don't know, a fishing boat on the next island 6 months ago. But what's happened recently with the extremists is there seems to have been some kind of union between the Salafi Wahhabi groups, the Salafi jihadi groups, and the gangs. So around 10 years ago, when things were really getting whipped up, Teesta mentioned the recruitment to the Syrian civil war, we saw gangs acting as sort of vigilante religious police, which we'd not seen before. They were plucking people off the street, they were interrogating them, and they were threatening to kill them. So there were a lot of whispers going around at what was happening, who was in charge of this. Was it the Salafi groups? Was it the gangs? And it turns out those two had become one and the same. And this is, this is extremely disturbing, actually. And I think this is what we're going to get onto next.
I remember my first time in Mafushi, which is one of the Maldives' largest inhabited islands, which was opened up for tourism. It's an island that you can walk on, in its entirety on foot. And at one end, there were tourists from mainly the Western world at the time. And when I finished my walk, I found that at the other end, there was this very oppressive-looking structure, which turned out to be the Maldives' largest prison. So when I came home and started reading about it, I learned something about the drug trade, but also that journalists were often jailed or abducted and even killed. So I wanted to mention two other instances of violence that rocked the Maldives. One was the murder of the wise, courageous young journalist Yamin Rashid, who was also one of Minivan's finest journalists, finest writers, as well as the disappearance and subsequent murder of Ahmed Rilwan, also one of Minivan's brave reporters. And apart from the fact that their families are still waiting to see justice done, with all the perpetrators having been released recently, in fact, since the election of 2023, it also heavily underlines, a serious case of intolerance towards the free press. So I'd be very keen to hear, Dan, about your take on why this road to justice has been so distressing for the families, and also about your own experience as a journalist in an increasingly intolerant country.
Riz, Ahmed Rilwan, he was the first person I hired when I became editor of the paper. He was the first person I hired for anything ever. And he was fantastic for about 8 months. He was the most reliable guy we had, and he had previously been radicalized and been a member of one of these Salafi jihadi groups, and then he kind of seen the light and decided it wasn't for him, and he'd come to Mysore to study journalism, and he came back to the Maldives and ended up working for me at the paper. He was followed by these gangs. He was stalked for a few weeks. He told us he was being followed. I asked him what he wanted to do, and he said, "Don't worry, these things happen all the time, it will be fine." And then he just disappeared. They took him from outside his house in August 2014, and we never saw him again. We knew quite quickly what happened. The rumors, you can't keep a secret in a place that small. Everybody knew. We knew. The police knew, and they didn't do anything about it. So, we're still waiting for justice for Riz. Yamin Rashid was somebody I met during the course of the search to find Riz. We became very close friends, and he refused to back down. Yamin actually studied here in Bangalore, so it's nice for me to be. He wrote very passionately about the place. He really loved the place, so it's nice to be here for that reason. Yamin was followed, and we knew he was being followed. And I asked him what he wanted to do, and he said, I'm not being chased away. But they followed him home in 2017, and they stabbed him to death outside his house. They later identified, when the new government came in, more liberal government, in 2018, they finally arrested some people. These men, 2 of them prominent gang leaders. One of them was this man who had been following them. They were all put in jail on pretrial detention up until about 3 months ago, and then they were all let out of jail. We kind of knew this was going to happen because they've been struggling to push the case through the courts. And as of last week, all the charges have been dropped. The stalker, let's call him a stalker, his name is Ismail Abdul Rahim. He's been seen pictured with the new president. This is the way it's going in the country. These people are lauded as heroes when there is substantial evidence against them, a terrorist conspiracy to murder 2 of my friends, and the government is doing less than nothing about it. My concern is now that they are free, they have complete impunity. There is no reason for them not to go out back on the streets and do the same thing again. I haven't been to the Maldives for 3 years. I want to go back in a couple of weeks, but I've had to promise my family that when I go, I won't publicize the book. Sorry, Teesta, I don't know if I mentioned that. Because they're not happy about me being there. It's not safe.
Since you mentioned the new president, and we only have, I think, 5 minutes left, I thought I'll quickly touch on what you think the new presidency means for the country. And also, because we are here talking about it, what it means for India-Maldives relations, because interestingly, President Mohammad Muizzu has broken with tradition for the first time, and instead of making a stop in India as, choosing India for his first international visit as president, he's gone to Turkey instead. What do you think that implies?
This comes directly from there's been an India Out campaign for about 10 years. The opposition, which was previously included President Mahmoud's brother, who became president between 2013 and 2018. This is Yamin Abdul Gayoom. They pushed this. They only really have 2 ways to do politics. They don't have much of an ideology. The Maldivian Democratic Party, which is the other side, they came out with the pro-democracy movement, and the rest are very reactive, very pragmatic. They do deen, religion, and they do gaum, which is nation. This is what they have: religion, nation. So the nation normally comes from this kind of xenophobic trait, which is not pleasant. And if the government is doing deals with India, for example, at the time, they will try and get rid of Indian influence. GMR was developing the airport back then. The MDP had given them a contract, so they pushed. They started this campaign to push GMR out. There was a coup in 2012, and very soon after, the deal with GMR was cancelled. They had to pay a lot of money in Singapore Court of Arbitration because of cancelling that deal. But this is just carried on. So for the last 5 years, India out has become the obsession of the opposition. I personally wouldn't take it too seriously because I like to say these guys are arch pragmatists, and they will realize that the people-to-people relations between the Maldives and India goes back thousands of years. The schools are full of Indian teachers, the hospitals are full of Indian doctors, and yes, there are some military troops which the new president has ordered out of the country, but I think they will be back before long because I don't know if the Maldives knows how to operate the helicopters that they gave them without the Indian troops. So I think Indian-Maldives relations will be fine once the crap goes away.
Right. On the note of pragmatism, I thought as a final question, I'll ask you about. I mean, we can have a quick chat about the climate crisis that's seriously threatening the Maldives, because it's really intriguing to learn of the new president's views on it. And again, I quote from your epilogue: when Muizzu was asked by Al Jazeera just days after his election win how he felt about predictions from NASA and others that 80% of the Maldives could be uninhabitable by 2050, he said, "It's always been the same story 50 years ago, and we don't see the sea level rise going up that much. If people come here and see for themselves, they will see that it's not true." So, do you want to comment on this statement and what it might mean for the dangers lapping at Maldivian shores?
I think it's a common problem with the Maldives that I don't know what they're expected to do about the climate crisis. Obviously, they can't mitigate. Nothing they do can really make an impact. All they can do is be advocates, but they have to be very strong advocates. You know, COP is happening right now, and the Maldives will need to be there pushing very hard for reparations. And I think that kind of rhetoric, it sounds like he's talking to prospective tourists, which is fine. You can still go there. The beaches are still nice, but it seems like the answer he gave to Al Jazeera was seriously underwhelming, and it didn't come across as the kind of guy that has clear vision. Former President Mohammed Nasheed, which may be the only Maldivian most people have heard of, he was very big on the climate crisis. He became kind of the poster boy for the climate crisis during his presidency. Before the coup, this was, he had very strong leadership, very strong-willed, a little bit too strong actually at times for some people. But Muizzu doesn't seem like that kind of guy. So I guess to wrap things up, if we're looking forward, no, I don't think Muizzu will break with India in a big way because I don't think he's got the ideological kind of heft for that. But at the same time, I don't think he'll prepare Maldivians to handle the climate crisis well because it's threatening this 3,000-year-old island culture. I don't think he's going to take a very proactive stance on that, and I don't think he's going to deal with these extremists either.
I think maybe not all hope is lost.